Hello and welcome everyone to another live Q&A with the Brand the Interpreter podcast. I am Mireya, your host for today's event, the host of the Brand the Interpreter podcast. And I'm very excited that if you are joining us live, that you are here. And if you're watching after the fact, I am so happy that you came back to listen to a little bit more of Cindy Roat, our guest today. Before I get to introducing Cindy and bringing her on stage to chat with us a little bit, I'd like to just take the opportunity to say thank you for first and foremost supporting the podcast. If you are following the podcast on any of the social media platforms, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, and potentially at some point TikTok. I don't know yet. I don't know if I'm ready for it yet, but if you are already following, again, I want to take the opportunity to say thank you. Like your support means a lot. It means a lot to the podcast, and it means a lot to the guests that take their time to join us and be a part of the conversations with you and sharing their knowledge. So it makes a big difference. So I appreciate your support, and I appreciate the fact that you guys are constantly sending out new ideas and just supporting me in the podcast and the guests. So thank you. I also wanted to send a reminder and let everyone know that if you've not already joined the email list, to please head on over to the website and click on the join the email list that button that's like located right on the home page, so that you get reminders of when new podcast episodes are coming up, and are getting reminded of events such as this one for today and any of future live events. So remember to head on over to the website, and I'll make sure to send that information towards the end, or right now at www.brandtheinterpreter.com on cue, so that you are able to join the email list. I also want to send a huge thank you to Mari Hernandez for gifting me this beautiful pin over at the ATA conference. Mari, thank you. It actually has come very handy, and it's super cute, and I love the opportunity to be able to show it off. Mari Hernandez is another community interpreter and follower of the podcast, so thank you so much, Mari. And then last but not least, I want to make sure that I send this reminder out that our next live will be taking place not next month, in December 15th, at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And we're going to have special guests coming back, returning guest, Yulia Sparov. So if you've listened to that podcast episode, please join us December 15. Mark your calendars. I'll be sending out communications as well, reminding you all of that next live. So, like I said, if you're not on the email list, please go and join the email list. Yeah, you do not want to miss that episode. I want to now take the opportunity to mention that our returning guest has already been with us. And if you've not had that opportunity to either listen or watch her episode on Brand the Interpreter podcast, please head on over to your favorite podcasting platforms or onto YouTube and watch her video. She gives us so much great information. She has the opportunity to share her backstory and how she started in the profession, which is, I think, super important, and why the podcast is created in that way, to give our guests the opportunity to share how they got started. That might be a way in which we can get started as well if we're just starting on the interpreting career pathway. And so, if you've not already, I encourage you to head on over, listen to her episode. It's entitled A Seat at the Table with Cindy Roat, and then it's also available on YouTube. So I want to welcome our guest for today, a returning guest, Cindy Roat, who is a consultant for language access in healthcare. But it's not that simple, because for the past 3 decades, Ms. Roat has made significant contributions both in the U.S. and abroad in many areas of language access. And so it's, calling her just a consultant and trainer for language access, I think it makes it sound really simple. Ms. Roat joins us today from Seattle, Washington, which I hear is super windy. So hopefully all goes well. But Cindy, thank you so much for joining us again, for joining us on this live Q&A. Welcome.
It is my pleasure to be here. I'm so honored to have been asked back. Thank you.
Yeah, are you kidding me? People were super excited to have you back. So I'm excited when people are excited to have you back because that means they're listening to, the information and are wanting to hear some more. So how about we get started?
Let's go.
All right, let's go for it then. Very first question submitted by Natalie Harquail. Natalie, thank you so much for engaging and submitting your question. Very much appreciated when they're submitting questions ahead of time so that our guests can prepare and read through your questions. So, very first question for today, Cindy, is can you make a decent living as an interpreter?
This is such a good this is such a good question and a really critical one. And as you all know, full disclosure, I don't make my living only as an interpreter anymore. But if I were coming into the field right now and I wanted to earn my whole living in the language fields, what I would try to do would be to diversify a little bit, to do some interpreting, to also do some translation if my language pair were appropriate, and if and if I could get trained in with that skill set, obviously, so I could do a good job. I would do some in-person interpreting. I would try to do some remote interpreting. I would try to find other areas of where languages are used, to kind of so that I wouldn't be doing just one thing. I do think that you can definitely earn a living as a staff interpreter in healthcare. Um, and if you can get one of those jobs, you can definitely earn a living that way. But I guess I'm thinking more freelancers. If I were going to freelance in this, I would definitely want to diversify and do a variety of things.
Yeah, and so that's a great point actually, Cindy, that you bring up because there is that opportunity to freelance, which means, you are in charge of looking for those assignments, right? Whether that's through an interpreting agency or with a direct client or the staff part, which is you are able to go work as an employee, with a company, correct?
Yeah.
Muy,
And a
muy
lot
bien.
of this depends on whether, are you the entrepreneurial type?
Mhm.
Do you like the flexibility of being able to take an appointment or not? To take an assignment or not? To uh, control your own time, your own calendar? Or
Right.
do you like the um, stability of being able to have a 9 to 5, 8 to 5 job where you know what your hours are going to be, you know what your income is going to be, your taxes are a lot easier to fill out, you know. So it's kind of like, what's your personality?
Very true.
And I think you have to work a little harder to make a living as an interpreter, as a freelancer. But it can bring you just tremendous variety of assignments and very interesting people that you meet. So, for a lot of people, I think it's a very exciting career.
Yeah, definitely. And full disclosure, will add to that, Cindy, that when I worked for the hospitals, it wasn't 9 to 5. We were there anytime. The hospitals
Well,
didn't
yeah,
close. We
that's
had
true.
a different schedule all the time, just depending, right, on the hospital. But absolutely, that's something also to consider if you're looking for something like a 9 to 5, then you want to make sure that that's something that you're looking out for when you're applying and making sure that that's actually the schedule because sometimes
Right.
that's
That good point.
right.
Very
Yeah,
good
that
point.
might
Yeah.
not be the schedule. All right. Well, that was a great question. Thank you so much, Natalie. If you're just starting out, I think that's always important, and it's always important to try to
I,
find out what's out there, right?
could
Like,
I also say this also depends on where you live?
true.
um, do you live in a big city? Do you live in a rural area? Probably easier to make a living at this in a big city, where there's multiple clinics, multiple hospitals, multiple agencies who will want to contract with you. Um, and then there's always working remotely, which means, there are a number of national and international remote interpreting companies, where it doesn't matter where you live. So even if you lived in rural areas, if you got good internet, then you could still access those jobs.
Yeah, great point. Thank you, Cindy. The next few questions that we are going to get into were submitted anonymously. So there's no name and no one to thank, but thank you anyway. So we're going to go in with the next question, Cindy, which is, what do you recommend to those that are working to standardize perhaps other specializations of interpreting, such as education, to consider as standards of practice are being developed?
Okay, and just to maybe put this in some context, my specialty has always been healthcare. I mean, that's the area that I know, the area that I worked. I have also done social service interpreting, for the welfare offices and support enforcement and those kind of services as well. And when I started in this field, medical interpreting was not at all developed. Legal interpreting was a little bit more developed. There were state certifications. There was, of course, the federal court certification. At that time, there was more training, it seemed, for court interpreters, and so um, those of us who were in healthcare kind of said, "Well, we need something specific to the healthcare setting." And why? The reason was that decisions are made differently in healthcare than they were in the legal setting. The people who make the decisions are different. The arguments for getting them to provide interpreters were different. The way interpreters were going to be integrated into the healthcare team were different than in the legal setting. So even though the bottom line, I mean, the act of interpreting itself might be fairly similar, regardless of venue, everything around it, and especially in terms of trying to advocate for more access, was very different in healthcare than it was in the legal setting. Um, and now we see there are, of course, other venues that are in themselves quite different. You mentioned education, and I'm absolutely thrilled to see interpreters in education starting to get together and to try to push the same way that we pushed in healthcare, starting 30 years ago, and we're still not there, not even
Yes.
close. But, I see now those groups in education starting to get organized and starting to try to create more of a profession. And I think what's really critical here is, first of all, you have to include the people who are doing the work. So these are not, I feel like the development of code of ethics, standards of practice, all of this, it isn't to be done by a small group of experts sitting in a room somewhere. There needs to be active input from the people who are out in the field doing interpreting in educational settings. Um, those of us whose most of our experience is in medical or social service, I mean, maybe we have a point of view that might inform the work of the people in education, but the bulk of the work needs to be done, in my mind, by the people that are actually doing this work, with, I think, also input from everybody who's involved. So input from teachers who are going to work with the interpreters, input from um, educational administrators in school districts who are going to be the ones to find the money to pay for these interpreters, input from families who will be depending on the interpreters to be able to communicate with the healthcare system. All these people need to have input into this. But I think when we talk about standards and all of that, there really needs to be done by a wide variety of people who are working in the field. Um, and my my tendency, and I'm a very linear thinker, so I'll just stick that out there. There's a little bias here. I'm a kind of a linear thinker. And I think that what really helped us in healthcare was starting out with a discussion about the role. We never quite came to complete and total agreement about this, by the way, but it was very telling because, at the beginning, some people thought that the role was much more, interpret what is said, convert from one language to another, and that's the sum total of your responsibility. If nobody understands it, not your fault, not your responsibility. And at the other end, we had community interpreters who really felt that their job was really to facilitate a good outcome in healthcare, which is quite broad. And so these discussions led us to kind of narrow the focus on the role, focus on language, but also to be able to say, yeah, there may be times that the interpreter needs to do a little bit more than simply render in one language what was said in the other, because the consequences of not understanding in healthcare are are very critical. So by starting out with a discussion of the role, that helped inform kind of the next step, which was uh, working on developing a national code of ethics. So a code of ethics has to come from the role, right? If you're going to say, what's ethical behavior and what isn't, that's going to be informed by what's considered to be in the role or out of the role. And then the next step are standards of practice, which really have to um, emerge out of a code of ethics. So the standards have to be based on on ethical principles, right? And
Mhm.
then you get the next level, which is uh, training. So, if we want people to be able to conform with these standards of practice, what should we be teaching them? What should be the training? And then once you know what the training is, then you can talk about certification and testing.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the possible dangers is trying to move forward too quickly with all of this.
Yeah.
Um, Certainly, um, I feel like social service interpreting, educational interpreting, going to be able to move much more quickly than we did in healthcare, because y'all have the internet, which we did not have when we started the healthcare interpreting. It was all by letters or phone calls or trying to get money to bring everybody together to have meetings, and man, that was a pain in the neck. Um, but so now there's like these Zoom and there's chats and there's a real chance of getting people together to talk without people having to travel, which is so expensive. So I
Mm,
know this is going to move forward much more quickly, but I hope that it doesn't move forward too quickly, so that this consultation with the base of people that are out there doing the work gets lost.
yeah.
Because if we learned so much, for example, when we actually sat down with Navajo interpreters, and like looked at the code of ethics and saw things that didn't work for Navajo interpreters, or when we sat down with the Hmong interpreters, or we sat down with the Somali interpreters, where there was input from these groups, folks that didn't have the wherewithal or the permission to maybe take leadership roles in these processes, but whose voices were very important and had to be um, not just requested, but actually actively sought to get this kind of input. So I guess those would be two things: that the need for this wide base of input, which takes time,
Excellent.
and the need to do things in a stepwise fashion so you don't end up having a certification test when there's no training, which is what Washington State did. And we've seen where that got us. Or where you don't end up having a certification test that's testing a whole bunch of skills that the people at the base say, wait a minute, that's not what I do,
That's not, yeah, it's not reflective of
of the
whatever.
work that I do. So I think, kind of a stepwise order can be important in this field.
So good. Yes, no, so important because yes, it made me think of what is the aim to be the first, to offer certification or to have something that is truly created, in service of the bigger outcome, right? So every step, like you say, that's so critical. So something that's robust, yes, but that's long lasting, and it's not going to feel like we've been, I say we, right, as the interpreters, boots on the ground, when we've been almost like let down, like, oh, we've been waiting for this certification because we feel, and then it's like non-reflective of what we're actually doing
Right.
because the aim was let's push this out. Not to say that anyone's working that way, but I think it's
Oh,
important, and that's just one area, right, in education,
and
which was great.
I remember when the discussion about certification was going on. At the time, I remember that the federal court certification had a 4% pass rate. 4%. That meant that of 100 people who took the test, 96 failed it. And I thought, that's a real um, it's a real waste of time and money. And that the fact is, you could walk in off the street and take that test with no training at all. And that's why both of the national certifications for healthcare both require 40 hours, which isn't enough, but
Yeah.
40 hours of basic training, so that at least by the time you get to the test, you've got some sense of, what it takes to be an interpreter, and you have some practice, and you know, you know, you have some skill development time. I think that that may be one of the reasons why the pass rate is much higher, and that is, because
Mm,
we've got people who've actually had some training. So
great
I
point.
my experience has been in the field is that a lot of times people want to rush directly to testing because it's nice to have a test, and if you can get certified, then it's nice to have that after your name. But if I had, a certain amount of money to spend, and I could either spend it on developing a test or I could spend it on training people, there is no question in my mind where I would go. I would spend it all on training, to try and get people more training, and then eventually I think certification, grows out of that. When you have
Exactly.
enough, you have a big enough cadre of people that has had an opportunity to get some basic training.
And this is huge. I feel that this is why it's so important for me to be able to share this information on platforms such as this one, so that others that are maybe not as involved as this question, maybe not as involved, but potentially waiting for the results, right? They're waiting for, oh, when are we going to get that, certification to come out, or the assessment to get certified? Why is this taking so long? It shouldn't,
Why is it
or
taking so
whatever.
long?
Yeah.
Right.
So
Exactly.
that people
Why is it time and
understand.
money, guys? Time and money. It's
Yeah, yeah.
both of those things are oftentimes in short supply.
And usually, like, I'm gonna go take it back to food, probably because it's around that time. If something that cooks slow is more delicious than something that cooks fast and ends up, for the most part, right, then ends up, burnt or something along the way. Probably a horrible example, but I think it's
No, you're
true, right?
probably right.
Like,
Unfortunately, I like cooking things that are fast. I don't know. What does it say about me? But yeah.
yeah,
I mean, the
no,
other thing to consider is that while there is grant money available to do this work, most of this is being done by volunteers.
mhm,
And, volunteers have a limited amount of time. And so there's only so fast you can push things forward if you're using volunteers and if you really are committed to getting wide input from the field. Here's
mhm,
another thing that worries me too. Um, it's so much easier now that there's the internet, right, to get wide input. But I worry that we leave people out that are maybe not tech savvy. Um, and I worry that we leave people out who might have other reasons for feeling uncomfortable joining in conversations online. And it's so much easier to do it online. But I wonder if there needs to be, multiple approaches, like some online, some in-person focus groups.
mhm,
Um, I don't know, some opportunities for people to write in, although, we know that oftentimes interpreters, may not be the best writers. So, just limiting for people to put in written comments, that would probably be very discriminatory as well. So
mhm.
it's really a question within the time that you have and the money that you have, which is always limited. How can you really make sure that you get input from the largest number of people? It's always a challenge.
That's always a challenge, definitely. Great points. Great points. Thank you so much, Cindy. We're going to move on to our next question, which is, what strategies or approaches would you recommend to those that are wishing to help educate people on why language
Mm.
services are so necessary?
This is a lesson I learned to my detriment early in my career, and that is we need to be able to speak the language of whoever it is that we're trying to convince. So if we are talking to administrators, we need to understand what worries administrators. what concerns administrators? What are the struggles that they're having every day? And how can we put the push for language access, how can we couch it in the terms of what is important to them? If we're talking to doctors, we need to know what's important to the doctors. What do they worry about? What keeps them up at night? In what way does language access impact them? We need to be, uh, willing to. It's not changing the message; it's kind of changing the way we talk about the message. So, I tell this story, and I think I told it on our podcast, right? Where I started out talking to a bunch of administrators in Atlanta, Georgia, hospital administrators. And it was early in my career, and I'd come at this from a position of social justice. And so I'm waving the Title VI, 1964 Civil Rights Act, Civil Rights flag, you guys are going to get dinged by, and they laughed at me. And they said, here in the South, the Office for Civil Rights is so taken up with responding to complaints based on racial discrimination that they're never going to get to looking at the complaints based on country of origin discrimination. And they just laughed, and I realized, wow, this was like the wrong approach. This was like totally the wrong approach. Um, if I were talking to a group of hospital risk managers, then maybe I should talk about all of the laws and the requirements and now there's a whole lot more of them, right? Um, and I should talk about limiting risk. I should talk about the lawsuits. I should talk about all this stuff. If I'm talking to doctors, I don't think that's where I need to be. I think I need to be talking about things that directly concern them, patient safety, um, the good health outcomes, uh, doing that kind of thing that they're worried about with every patient they see, and to be able to couch everything that I say in those kind of terms. Um, I also think we need to know, how do different groups receive education. I found again that you can have a class and require residents to come to it. However, um, you can't require doctors to come. A lot of doctors at the time that I started out weren't actually employees. They had rights to admit patients, but they weren't employees. You couldn't get them to come to trainings. However, online training with continuing medical education credits attached, that was a little bit helpful. And I remember um, Hennepin County Medical Center, if I'm correct, one year said, you know what, we will pay for a certain number of credits of continuing medical education for you. And here are your three choices of classes that you can take. And one of them was a class on working with interpreters. And so they could get continuing medical education. It was paid for by the hospital, and they could take it whenever they wanted to, at night, on the weekends, when they had time over their lunch hour, they could stop it, they could start it. And so this fit with the way that they needed to get input. On the other hand, administrators, it was a different thing. Half an hour meetings. That's about as much as I could ever get with administrators. It had to be really quick and right to the point.
Mhm.
Um, and kind of in a meeting format was good. You have to know, if you can get access to the publications. So when issues of language access started to show up in the Journal of the American Medical Association, that was huge. When it started showing up in the New England, right, New England Medical Journal, that was huge because those were major, the places where doctors went to get their their information about what was new. So I think you need to think about, uh, who are you trying to reach, and what is the best way to reach that person. Um, what's the best way to reach them and to engage them in a conversation. And so that's the other thing, is to not only be trying to push your agenda, but also to hear about what is the agenda, um, what's their agenda. what kind of problems do they have, um, with what, and when you make suggestions, what challenges does that create for them? And so, maybe you can, help think that out. So anyway, that's just some ideas that I have for
No,
reaching
it's
out to
great.
people.
Totally makes sense to me, because I think when we talk about, knowing our audience and being able to connect with them based on relevancy. Yes, do we want to show up with it to an administrator and say, you need to worry about this other item too, in addition to everything else that
Else they're
you
worrying
are
about.
worrying about, right? So if we're making those connections and really tailoring our message based on relevance, like you say, based on what is important to them perhaps at the time, or what they're seeing come up, it makes a difference in the conversation, because now their ears might like perk up and say, let me listen to what you have to say with regards
Yeah,
to
I
this.
mean, imagine a hospital administrator who's mostly concerned, um, with, whose major problem right then is, like a nursing shortage, right? And if you were to say to them, "Listen, if we could work more with dedicated interpreters, we wouldn't be pulling the nurses off to interpret, the bilingual nurses off to interpret,
Mhm.
right?" And that would free the nurses up to be doing patient care. That might be of interest to them. Or if you were to say, maybe let's say that the hospital is having a problem with their bounce back rate. That means people who are discharged for a particular, diagnosis, who end up being readmitted within a week for the same diagnosis. That's not good. And under the Affordable Care Act, the hospitals don't get paid for that second visit, right? That's a that's a cost to the hospital. So if you could say, look, for these patients who are LEP, if we can have an interpreter there for their discharge instructions, if we can send them home with discharge instructions recorded on their phone bilingually, so that they can listen to the discharge instructions over and over again, wow, this might be a way um, to help reduce the bounce back rate. Now we're dealing with language access, but in a format of something that they're already very worried about. So knowing your audience, I think, is a big part of this.
Yeah, no, that those are excellent points, excellent points, because I think it's like anything else when it comes to presenting information, it's super helpful to understand who your audience is. If we're telling our administrators, or the people that are having meetings, with the folks that we're servicing, well, they don't speak the language, or you can't have them sign paperwork or read paperwork because they can't read or they can't write, or that's also in a way saying, know who your audience is, know who these families that we're servicing are. So in the
Right.
same way, but different, we're doing the same thing when we're presenting
Exactly.
information, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I was embarrassed that I did so poorly at this at the beginning of my career, because it's like I I was an interpreter. It was all about speaking to people in a language they understood. So how did I miss that? Well, it took some experience to figure it
It,
out.
yeah, it took some time. It took conversations such as the one you were having, going out there and having those conversations, and having them, basically
Laugh at
respond
me.
back,
Yeah,
right?
really.
Respond back. Okay, that didn't work. So what's next? Right,
What's next?
absolutely. All right. Well, let's move on to our last question, Cindy, before you leave us for today, which is, despite facing the challenge of people calling you out for being in a position of leadership, and I imagine in this, in this realm, and being a position of leadership in this industry, and having people viewing it as institutional racism, you continue leading conversations in this field. What's your motivation? What's your motivation to continue? And I think where this is going is, um, basically saying, you have people coming at you, and some people would say, I don't want to do this anymore, because if this is, no one can take things like that lightly, right? I'm sure, I imagine we talked about it on the podcast, that this has been a challenge throughout your professional career, and people making statements such as these, but yet you continue being in this conversation of, this is important. Language access is important. Leading conversations like this is important. How do you stay motivated in spite of things like that?
Sure. Well, and I'm just gonna, I'm not gonna put fancy words on it. I mean, the question that has come up is, um, language access is a field that is there to benefit, um, people who speak English less than very well, generally speaking, refugees and immigrants. I'm not a refugee. I'm not an immigrant. I'm white. I'm well educated, and um, and you could kind of look at that and say, well, this is not a person who has any kind of a right to be in a leadership position in this field. And the first time that this came up, I was surprised, um, partially because of my own ignorance about these issues, and partly because I saw myself as an interpreter. So I kind of felt like I was part of the group that, I felt like I was an interpreter helping to lead interpreters in trying to make rules and trying to have discussions about how we should be doing our work. So I kind of felt like I was part of the group, not um, an outside the group.
Mhm.
Um, and the two or three times that these issues have been brought up again and again, um, I guess I continue to be in this field and to continue to try to lead conversations, um, because I really believe that we need to provide language access for the patients and for the families and for the providers, for the whole healthcare system. I think it's for everybody. It's an issue of social justice for patients and their families, but it's also an issue of good healthcare. And it's an issue of our healthcare systems running, to being the best that they can possibly be within any limitations. I think that we all need to be at the table. So I don't feel like my withdrawing from this conversation would help anybody. I think it would. I don't think it would help anybody. I think that maybe the way I do this I've needed to change. I've needed to become more aware of, um, who else is at the table with me, and using any influence that I might have to bring more diverse people, to the table so that we can all join in the conversation. Um, but I had an interesting, two things I wanted to share. Um, One is I had an interesting experience in graduate school. I have a graduate degree in international public health. And I had for years lived and worked in various parts of rural Latin America. And when I was in graduate school, I was offered a consultancy to work in Turkey with a group that was, um, developing training for Turkish midwives. The goal was to improve the knowledge and skills of the midwives and to get them the resources that they needed in order to be able to give better pre and perinatal care for the patients that they were attending in rural areas of Turkey. And I turned down the job because I felt that I didn't speak Turkish. I didn't understand Turkish culture. I mean, I knew nothing about Turkish culture. Um, I felt that I would be depending heavily on local people to try and tell me, what needed to be done and how it needed to be done. Whereas, in Latin America, I had spent so many years, I felt like I had a little bit of a grasp, and I spoke Spanish, so I felt like I really had a little bit of a better grasp on it. And I remember my advisor, really came down on me for that. And he said, "Okay, so you're not going to take this job." I said, "That's right. I don't feel like I'm the right person. I don't feel I'm qualified." And he said, "Well, you are a white person who doesn't speak Turkish and who knows nothing about Turkish culture, um, and who understands that you would need to depend and lean heavily on local people, midwives themselves, to tell you what needed to be done. So now you haven't taken this job. And instead, this agency is going to give it to somebody who is white, and who doesn't speak Turkish and who knows nothing about Turkish culture, but who thinks they have all the answers. And it made me realize that I wasn't the perfect person for that job, but maybe I would have been an okay person for that job, because of the way I approached it. And I thought of something that I read that was written by Marianne Williamson. And she said, your playing small in the world doesn't serve the world. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you.
Mm.
And I thought, yeah, I might not be the perfect person to do this work, but I have done it for a long time and I have something to bring to the table. And I also know the limitations of what I know. So maybe there's still a role for me in this. And if people ask me to speak and I can use that voice to raise issues like this, then maybe that's a good use for that voice. I also hope that as we continue these conversations, I will continually be taught about where my shortcomings are or where the flaws in my approach are or where I'm not being as inclusive as I should be. And that way I grow, and hopefully having those conversations more publicly helps all of us grow. So that's why I'm still here, right or wrong, and always looking forward to input from the folks around me.
And we're all so happy that you're still around because absolutely, I think, I mean, God, you said it so beautifully, even with that quote, doing the right thing is everyone's responsibility, not just a select group of people's responsibility. And what good would we be if we weren't adding everyone's input and experiences coming from this angle, coming from that angle? So and I love the fact that you mentioned that perhaps what I learned, not perhaps, but what I learned was that perhaps I should be looking around and seeing who else can I bring to the table, which is why the episode is called A Seat at the Table, guys,
Yeah,
because it's a big lesson learned
there you
for
go.
Cindy and for all of us is that we should be looking around, not just thinking I'm the one that should come up and have this conversation because it has affected me, or I know more, or right. We should be looking around and considering who else should be at the table. Cindy, as always, it is such a pleasure to have a conversation with you. I am ever so grateful that you said yes to coming back and sharing your time, just giving away your time to us that I know we've been loving the content and really enjoying the information. Before you leave, I just want to make sure that I share that we've got on the live so Living Adventures. I'm not sure if that's the Living Adventures is the name, but the person saying hello, and Kareen Hillstrom is saying hello. Yulia is here with us today, and she just wanted to let you know that you are more than
A
just having
legend. Oh, great.
consulting, a legend. So thank you
Ooh,
for
I, f-
having shared that. And then Julieta also joined us and wanted to also let you know that I told you you had fans, Cindy, that she loves Cindy Roat, and she really wanted to join in and and come on board and listen to you. And Mari that joined the live as well, letting you know that she loved that quote. That
I
was a
love that
beautiful
quote
quote.
too.
Yes, that was a beautiful quote. Thank you for being here, Mari. Thank you, everyone that joined, especially you, of course, Cindy. Like I said, this was so special to be able to have the opportunity to have a returning guest. Your episode was very deep, and these conversations are very important. And as we mentioned and we talked about right before joining, the live, is that it gives this platform. This platform gives the others the opportunity that potentially may be encountering similar situations or thinking of similar things, the opportunity to hear firsthand from those that are actually experiencing or that have gone through these things, and just be able to relate and know how do you get it, how do you move forward from this. So I'm so glad and so grateful that you said yes to the re-invite, and perhaps one day we'll have an opportunity to have another chat. Thank you so much, Cindy, for
Thank
joining us.
you. Goodbye,
Thank you.
everybody.
I want to just remind everyone that a couple of things. First and foremost, I want to say thank you to everyone that joined the live. Diane, hi, I see you. Just reminding you that this recording will stay on the YouTube platform. So if you are interested in going back and listening, these live events are specifically for the YouTube channel. So feel free to go back as soon as this is done. It'll be living in the YouTube channel. Remember to subscribe so that you are reminded of the upcoming lives. The one that will be taking place next month in December will be with, actually, we have her here today in the audience, will be with Yulia Sparov, also a returning guest. If you want to have the opportunity to listen to her episode, she's also on the Brand the Interpreter podcast. I'm trying to see if I could grab the episode number, but go on over to your favorite podcasting platform and look for Yulia's episode and then take a listen. And then when you see the information come up on social media platforms, feel free to submit the questions that you may have based on that, or maybe just in general that you may have. We welcome questions, and of course, the guests, really appreciate being able to see your questions before they come up. If you've not already joined the email list, make sure to subscribe. Head on over to the website at www.brandtheinterpreter.com and subscribe to that email list so that you get the reminders of things that are coming up for the podcast. I do hope that next year we continue to have these lives with returning guests and make them where we are able to hold on to our questions and then present them to our guests for these lives that are shorter, a lot shorter than your podcast episodes. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And oh, hi, Maria. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. And we'll connect soon, perhaps tomorrow, Friday, when I release a new episode of the Brand the Interpreter podcast. Take care, guys, and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.